Welcome to 21st Sports Recap and Reaction for the Minnesota Vikings at the Atlanta Falcons in their Week 12 matchup played November 29th, 2015. And we're going to go over every possession, and we're also going to go over the stats and give our breakdown and analysis. So the Vikings would punt on their first possession after 4 plays, and then the Falcons went 3 and out, and they punted the ball back to Minnesota. So now the Vikings took over on their own 22, and they would end up bringing the ball into Atlanta territory. They were faced with a 3rd and 8 from their own 32. Bridgewater hit Stephon Diggs. He picked up 16 yards. He got called for an unsportsmanlike conduct penalty after the play, and so it would be a first down, but they would actually only end up with 1 yard on the play as they had a first down on the 31, as that was the beginning of some suspect officiating by the officials in this game. But on 2nd and 9 from the 30, Bridgewater hit Rudolph. He picked up 13 and brought the ball into the red zone. Then they were faced with a 3rd and 9 from the Atlanta 16, and a penalty for pass interference would make it a 1st and goal on the 1, and Peterson punched it in from a yard out, and Walsh added the extra point, and so now it was 7-0 Vikings over the Falcons. So the referees just handing Minnesota that 7 points there. And now on the first play from scrimmage on the next possession, Tevin Coleman picked up 46 yards, but then a heads-up play by Barr as he forced a fumble. Exum would recover as Barr just punched the ball loose from behind. It wasn't really so much Coleman's fault. There's not really much he could have done there to protect the ball other than maybe switch hands, although I don't know if that would have made a difference. So now Minnesota would take over after the fumble, and they would bring the first quarter to a close. Then in the second quarter, still the same possession from the Atlanta 22, as they were now in field goal range right on the edge of the red zone. It was 2nd and 8, and this was about 45 seconds into the second quarter. Bridgewater was intercepted by Allen, so they don't get any points off of that fumble, and now the Falcons would get the ball off of the interception as they would answer with a turnover, forcing a turnover. So now Atlanta took over on their own 20 after the interception, and they would bring the ball into Minnesota territory, but their drive would end up stalling in the red zone at the Minnesota 13, and so they would have to settle for a 31-yard field goal attempt by Graham. It was up, it was good, and that put the first points on the board for the Falcons as they now trailed the Vikings by 4 with the score 7-3, Minnesota in the lead with a little over 6 minutes left before halftime. The Vikings would punt after 5 plays on their next possession, and Atlanta would take over, backed up against their own end zone on their own 15-yard line. They would get a first down, a couple of them, and they would actually bring the ball into Minnesota territory. But on 2nd and 3 from the Minnesota 43, Matt Ryan was intercepted by Captain Munnerlyn, and so now the Vikings had the ball back with just about a minute and a half left before halftime, and they would end up bringing the ball into field goal range as the half was coming to a close. And with just seconds left on the clock, Blair Walsh would attempt a 51-yard field goal, but it was no good as it was wide left. So it was 7-3 going into halftime. And on the first possession of the second half, the Falcons got the ball. They got down into the red zone all the way down to the 1-yard line, and Coleman scored on a touchdown, but then a clipping penalty against Atlanta would erase the points off the scoreboard and put them back on the 15-yard line, 2nd and goal, and they would end up on 3rd and goal as they end up with another penalty. This time, though, it was against Minnesota, and so now they ended up with a 3rd and goal on the Minnesota from the Minnesota 14, and Matt Ryan was intercepted in the end zone by Newman. So Newman gets the ball back for the Vikings right when Atlanta had scored but had the points erased, and then was right there still in the red zone but couldn't get any points, not even a field goal. But Minnesota would get a field goal on their next possession as they would drive down the field into the red zone, and their drive stalled on the Atlanta 11 where Blair Walsh hit a 29-yard field goal with less than 2 minutes left in the third as the Vikings extended their lead to 7 with the score Minnesota 10, Atlanta 3. So now the Falcons would get the ball and they would punt after 4 plays, and Minnesota now would get the ball back in the fourth quarter as the Falcons had brought the third quarter to a close. But now in the fourth quarter, Minnesota would start off on their own 12-yard line, and they would drive down the field into Atlanta territory. But then they ended up having to settle for a 39-yard field goal with about 6.5 minutes left in this game. So they killed a lot of clock on this possession. And so now the score was 13-3 with a 39-yard field goal by Walsh as they extended their lead to 10. So Atlanta would take over after the field goal, and they had it on their own 39 to start their next possessions. They had a 44-yard return by Weems. So good field position for Atlanta, but they would actually be faced with a 4th and 1, and they would go for it. But Matt Ryan was sacked, and he fumbled the ball, and it was recovered by Atlanta, but it didn't matter because they did not get the first down, and so that meant that they turned the ball over on downs, and now Minnesota would take over on the Atlanta 40, and on 3rd and 5, Adrian Peterson ran it 35 yards into the end zone. Blair Walsh hit the extra point, and it was now 20-3 as the Vikings led by 17. So Atlanta would take over after the touchdown on their own 20 after the touchback on the kickoff, and they quickly moved down the field, and they would end up with a touchdown as Matt Ryan hit Nick Williams for a 1-yard touchdown, and then Graham added the extra point, and it was now 20-10, but with just a minute and a half left, that would pretty much do it. They did go for the onside kick, but they were not able to convert that, so Minnesota recovered, and Teddy Bridgewater took 3 knees, and that did it for this game as the Vikings hold on to win 20-10 over the Falcons. So it was a big win for Minnesota in this game, a rough loss for the Falcons, as there was definitely some questionable officiating in this game that really hurt Atlanta. It really changed the momentum in this game as the Falcons, they had a chance, they went ahead, but then the referees took the points off the scoreboard. The referees were, setting up the Vikings. They set them up to score their first touchdown of the game, as it seemed like the referees, all the calls were going in Minnesota's ways and everything was hurting Atlanta in terms of the officiating. But the Vikings are now 8-3. They're in first place in the NFC North, as they're now a game ahead of the Green Bay Packers, who lost to the Chicago Bears on Thanksgiving night. So the Vikings take first place. They're up by half a game going into the game. Now they're up by a full game with the win. Of course, if they lost, it would have been a tie. But they're 4-2 on the road. They pick up another road win, as they definitely have been playing good on the road in the second half of the season. And Atlanta continues to slide. They're 6-5 on the season now, 3-3 at home. So the Falcons, another loss. They did get some good performances, but it wasn't enough. And of course, Matt Ryan, those 2 interceptions. Minnesota's defense coming up really big in this game. And Teddy Bridgewater was 20 for 28, 174 passing yards, no touchdowns, 1 interception. Adrian Peterson, 29 carries for 158 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also had 2 catches for 29 yards, which gave him 187 total yards on the day. Kyle Rudolph was the leading receiver for Minnesota. The tight end had 7 receptions for 53 yards, and Stephon Diggs had 4 receptions for 31 yards. And for the Falcons, Matt Ryan, 22 of 31, 230 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Tevin Coleman had 18 carries for 110 yards. He did have that fumble, though, early on in the game. Like I said, though, it wasn't really his fault per se, as it was just a good play by the defense coming up from behind, knocking the ball loose. Jacob Tamme was the leading receiver for the Falcons. The tight end had 5 receptions for 69 yards. Roddy White had 6 receptions for 60 yards. And Julio Jones had 5 receptions for 56 yards. We look at the kickers. Blair Walsh, 2 for 3 on the field goals, 2 for 2 on the extra points. Graham was 1 for 1 on the field goals, 1 for 1 on the extra points, playing in place of the injured Matt Bryant. And we look at the defense, and for the Vikings, Anthony Barr had a sack, 2 forced fumbles for Barr. Captain Munnerlyn had an interception, as did Newman, as they had a couple of turnovers there. It was 3 turnovers. Everson Griffin had a sack as well. And for Atlanta, Allen had an interception. And then we look at the team stats. 24 first downs for the Vikings. Very balanced attack. 11 on the ground, 10 through the air. And for the Falcons, they had 22 first downs. And they were relying mainly on the pass for those first downs, as 14 of those were through the air, just 2 first downs on the ground, although Coleman did have over 100 yards rushing. We look at third down efficiency, 7 of 12 for Minnesota, 58% conversion rate, 5 of 11 for Atlanta, 45% conversion rate. They went for it once on 4th down. They did not convert. They ended up turning the ball over on downs. That was that 4th and 1 play late in the game there in the 4th quarter. And, of course, ended up with a sack and a fumble. They did recover that fumble, but it didn't matter because they didn't pick up the first down. Then we look at the total net yards, 365 for Minnesota, 329 for Atlanta. And on the ground, the Vikings netted 191, the Falcons 116. Through the air, the Falcons netted 213. Matt Ryan sacked twice, losing 17 total yards. And for the Vikings, they netted 174 through the air. Then we look at the penalties in this game. 9 penalties against the Vikings for 53 yards. And the Falcons, 6 penalties, but for 78 yards. So they had 3 less penalties, but 25 more penalty yards. And they did fumble it twice, the Falcons. They lost it once. That was the fumble by Coleman that was lost. Matt Ryan had that fumble, but they did recover that, but it was a turnover on downs. Then we look at the red zone, and both teams struggling in the red zone. The Vikings 1 for 2, just 50%. They only had 2 red zone opportunities. And for the Falcons, just 1 for 3 in the red zone, just 33% in the red zone. And the time of possession, 33 minutes, 28 seconds for Minnesota, 26 minutes, 32 seconds for Atlanta. But the Vikings defense really is the story here. They came up big in this game, forcing those 3 turnovers. Of course, those 2 interceptions also coming up big in the red zone. And, of course, a couple of sacks as well. And the Minnesota Vikings, number one reason why they are in first place in the NFC North is that defense. But let me know what you think in the comments section below. Definitely interested to read your thoughts and opinions. Thank you very much for listening. It's greatly appreciated. I hope you're having a good day and had a great weekend and had a happy holiday and enjoyed all the sports.